Tales of Yado Ueda Akinari, Asajiga Yado. In the village of Korimanama in Katsushika County, Shimousa Province, there was a man named Katsushiro. He had lived in this village for a long time, since his grandfather's generation, and he had a wealthy family with plenty of fields. But because he was born with a carefree and easygoing nature, he disliked farming as a hassle and eventually became poor. In the meantime, he became estranged from many of his relatives, which Katsushiro found frustrating, and he pondered over how he could somehow restore his family's fortunes. At that time, a man named Sasabe Suji came from the capital every year to buy silk for ashikaga dyeing. He often visited distant relatives in the village of Mama, and since he had become a friend of Katsushiro's, he asked Sasabe if he too could become a merchant and go to the capital. Sasabe readily agreed, saying, "Around what date do you plan to leave next time? Please come with me." So Sasabe was happy to have a request from him and sold all the remaining rice fields to make money, which he used to buy a lot of white silk. He was ready, waiting for the day to go to the capital. Katsushiro's wife Miyagi was strikingly beautiful, had a good disposition, and was intelligent. When her husband mentioned recently that he wanted to buy some goods and go to the capital to do business, she found it troublesome and tried to dissuade him in various ways. But he was usually stubborn and would not listen when he made up his mind, and this time he was especially determined. So there was nothing she could do, though she felt lonely and anxious about their future lives. She diligently prepared for her husband's journey, and on the night before they left they spoke fondly of the difficult parting. "When you leave me on this journey, I am left alone in this house with no possessions. I am a weak and unreliable woman, completely at a loss as to what to do, and it is extremely painful. Please do not forget about me morning and evening, and please come back soon. I want to at least survive until the day you return. If I am alive, I believe we will meet again, but as this world is destined for us, we do not know what tomorrow will bring, so please pity my strong-willed manly heart." Her husband replied, "Why should I linger in a foreign country with such an uneasy feeling and life, like I am living on a driftwood? I will surely return this autumn when the kudzu leaves are blown over by the wind. Just wait patiently for me." While he was comforting his wife, dawn broke, and as the roosters crowed, they set off, hurrying for Kyoto. In that year, the summer of the 4th year of the Kyotoku era, there was a rift between the Kamakura Kubo Ashikaga Shiguji and the shogunate's regent, the Usuji clan, and in the ensuing fires of war the Kubo's mansion was burned down to the ground, forcing him to defect to his allies in Shimousa. Since then, the whole of the Kanto region was thrown into chaos, with people of all ranks and backgrounds becoming disorganized and without unity. Elderly people fled to the mountains, young people were drafted into the ranks of soldiers, and women and children fled in panic, from east to west, crying and lamenting as rumors rang out that, "Today we're going to burn this place down, and tomorrow the enemy will attack." Katsushiro's wife also wanted to run away somewhere, but she relied on her husband's words, "I'll be back this fall, so wait for me," and stayed home, anxiously counting down the days until her husband's return. Autumn came, but there was no news from her husband, and she resented her husband's cold-heartedness, thinking that the worsening state of affairs and the unreliable hearts of people were the result of her own sadness, and she became deeply depressed, thinking, "No one will tell my husband how sad I am, waiting for my husband to return. Oh, chicken of Mount Osaka, you're so close to Kyoto, so please tell my husband that the promised autumn has already ended." So she poured her feelings into a poem, but her husband lived far away, separated by many countries, and she had no way to send him this poem. As the world became more turbulent, people's hearts also became more hostile. When people who happened to visit saw Miyagi's beauty, they would try to seduce her with various acts of kindness, but Miyagi, remaining faithful as a faithful woman, treated them coldly and later closed the door and refused to meet them. The only maid she had left also took leave, and the small amount of savings she had was completely gone, leaving her feeling lonely as the 4th year of the Kyotoku era came to an end. A new year had come, but the turmoil in the world was still not over. Furthermore, in the autumn of the previous year, by order of the shogunate in Kyoto, Shimousa no Kami Tsunori, the lord of Gujo in Mino Province, was dispatched as commander-in-chief to the east, descending on the Shimousa domain and joining forces with his relative Chiba Saintain to launch an attack, forcing the shogunate to strengthen its defenses and fight back, so that it was unclear when the fighting would end. Taking advantage of the war, bandits from all over the country also set up strongholds here and there, setting fire to private homes and plundering at will. There was no peace in the entire Kanto region now, and it was a pathetic and terrible loss to the world. Katsushiro accompanied Sasabe to the capital and sold all of his white silk. This was during the Toyama period under Shogun Yoshimasa, and the capital was a time when extravagance was popular. He made a considerable profit from this and was preparing to return to his hometown when word spread that the Usuji forces had recently attacked the Kamakura shogunate's palace and pursued the fleeing Nariuji, causing fighting and commotion everywhere around his hometown of Katsushika, turning the streets into a war zone. Even in the midst of current events, the world is prone to tell lies, but in a faraway country where white clouds were falling, it was difficult to ascertain the truth of the matter, and he was all the more anxious. He left the capital at the beginning of August and took the Kiso Highway. As he was about to cross Masakado in Kiso at dusk, thieves blocked his path and stole all his belongings. Moreover, I heard from people that new checkpoints would be set up in various places in the east, and that even travelers would not be allowed to pass through. With this, I had no way to return to my hometown, let alone send any news. My house would have been destroyed in the war. My wife was probably not alive. If that was the case, I thought that my hometown was no better than a place where demons live, and when I tried to return to the capital from here, I entered the province of Omi, but suddenly felt unwell and fell ill with a fever. In a place called Musa, there was a rich man named Kodama Kahiai. This was the family home of Sasabe's wife, so I visited them and pleaded with him. Kahiai kindly accepted and looked after me kindly, calling a doctor and giving me medicine as best he could. Thanks to him, I seemed to feel a little better after a while, so I deeply thanked him for his kindness and wanted to leave his house, but I still couldn't walk well, so I stayed here that year and welcomed the new year. In the meantime, he had made friends in the village, and because of his naturally honest and straightforward nature, he formed friendly relations with Kodama and the other local people. After this, he would go to the capital to visit Sasabe, then return to Omi and stay at Kodama's house, and the 7 years passed by in a flash, like a dream. In the 2nd year of Kansho, the war over the succession of the Hatakeyama brothers in Kawachi Province near Kinai showed no signs of ending, causing turmoil near the capital, and on top of that, a virulent epidemic began to spread from spring, with corpses piling up in the streets, causing fear and trembling in people's hearts. They wondered if this was the end of the world and were deeply saddened by the impermanence of life. Thinking carefully, Katsushiro realized that he had fallen so low and had no real work to do. What could he rely on? Staying in a place far from his hometown, relying on complete strangers. For how long should his life continue to be lived in vain? Not even knowing whether his wife Miyagi, whom he had left behind in his hometown, was alive or dead, and that it was his unfaithfulness that had caused him to spend so many years in this place overgrown with forget-me-nots, forgetting his wife and his hometown. Even if his wife had died and was no longer in this world as before, he wanted to at least visit her remains or the place where she died and build a grave for her. He shared his feelings with the people, and when the sun cleared up during the May rains, he said his farewells and returned to his hometown after a journey of about 10 days. When I set foot in my hometown, the sun had already set in the west, and the rain clouds hung so low and dark that it seemed as if they might rain at any moment. But since I had lived in my hometown for a long time, there was no way I would get lost. So I made my way through the fields overgrown with summer grass. The famous Mamatsujibashi Bridge has now fallen into the river rapids, so as in the old song, I could no longer hear the footsteps of horses, and there was no traffic, and the surrounding fields had become overgrown, and I could no longer tell where the roads that used to be there were, and the old houses were nowhere to be seen. Among the houses that remain here and there are some that appear to be inhabited, but they are in a state that bears no resemblance to what it used to be. While he was wondering which house he used to live in, he saw a towering pine tree split by lightning about 30 to 40 meters away, dimly visible in the starlight filtering through the clouds. When Katsushiro saw it, he immediately felt happy and realized that he had seen the sign of the eaves of his house. He stepped in that direction, but the house remained unchanged. Moreover, it seemed that someone was still living there, as the light of the lamps flickered through the gaps in the old door. His heart suddenly began to beat faster, and he stood at the gate to signal that someone had arrived. Someone from inside the house heard him and asked, "Who is it?" The voice was very loud, but Katsushiro knew it was his wife's voice. His heart started beating fast, wondering if he was dreaming. "It's me. I've come home. But even so, it's really strange that you're still alive and alone in this overgrown wilderness." Even from inside the house, he realized it was her husband's voice, so he opened the door right away. His wife appeared at the door, covered in a lot of dirt and dark, with sunken eyes and her hair that had been tied up in a mess, hanging down her back. She had changed so much that it was hard to believe she was the same beautiful Miyagi from long ago. Seeing her husband, she said nothing but just burst into tears. Katsushiro was also so distraught that he could not speak for a while, but then he said, "If I knew that I had been able to survive this long, why would I spend so many years in another country? In fact, when I was in the capital last year, I heard about the war in Kamakura, and that the shogun's forces had been defeated and were fleeing to Shimousa to defend themselves, while the Kanryai's forces were about to attack them. The next day, I left the capital with Sasabe and at the beginning of August, and traveled along the Kiso road, but on the way I was surrounded by a large number of bandits who robbed me of all my clothes, gold, and silver, and I barely escaped with my life. Furthermore, I heard from the villagers that new checkpoints had been set up along the entire Takado and Tosando roads, blocking off travel by people. Also, a messenger from the capital came down yesterday to join the Usuji side. He said that he had rallied and gone to the Battle of Shimousa. He had heard that his hometown had been burned down long ago, and that it had been completely trampled under the hooves of war horses. He had assumed that you had been burned to death in the fires of war or drowned in the sea and had given up. He had returned to the capital and lived there for 7 years, living under the care of others. However, recently he had been feeling a strong longing for you, and so he had returned, hoping to at least see you after your death and mourn for you. He had never expected that you would be safe. The clouds over the mountain of the oracles, perhaps a vision of the Han Palace, he said, repeating the same thing over and over again without any answers. His wife also held back tears and said, "After I said goodbye, I had been hoping and waiting for you to return home, but before autumn came, the world had already become a frightening place. All the villagers had abandoned their homes and fled to the sea or the mountains. The few people who remained were, most of them, like tigers or wolves, with fearsome, greedy, and reckless hearts. Perhaps they thought it was a good thing that I was living alone, and they tried to seduce me with clever words. But as you said, I will die defending my chastity, but I will not tread the path of adultery to survive, and so I have endured many hardships." Then the Milky Way became clear and autumn came, when the two stars of Altair and Weaver Girl met, but you did not return. I waited through winter and the spring came, but I have not heard from you. I thought I would go up to the capital to visit you, but I wondered how a weak woman like me could get past the strict security of the checkpoint, which even a grown man would not be allowed to pass through. So I spent the rest of the day in this house, where there was no point in waiting, gazing at the pine tree on the eaves, and spending my days alone with the fox and the owl as my friends. Now that I have met you, I am glad that my long-held resentment has been completely cleared. As the old song says, if I were to die of longing while waiting to meet you, your partner would not understand my feelings, and it would be a very disappointing and pathetic thing to do. She cried again, and Katsushiro comforted her by saying, "The night is short, so let's do it again tomorrow," and they both went to bed together. The pine wind blew in through the torn paper screens of the windows, making it cool and comfortable all night long. Moreover, the fatigue of the long journey meant that Katsushiro fell into a deep sleep. As the dawn sky began to open, he still felt cold, even in his dreamlike state, and as he groped around to put on his nightgown, he was woken by a rustling sound. Something cold splashed on his face, and wondering if rain had leaked in, he opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling. The roof had been blown back by the wind, and the light of the early morning moon had faded, leaving a faint white glow in the sky. He looked around in surprise and saw that the house was so dilapidated that there were barely any doors. Reeds and silver grass were growing tall from gaps in the collapsed wooden floor, and the morning dew that spilled from them made his sleeves wet and wring. Ivy and kudzu were growing on the walls, the garden was overgrown with weeds, and even though it was not yet autumn, the house looked as overgrown and dilapidated as an autumn field. But then, where could his wife, who was supposed to have slept with him, have gone? He could not find her. Wondering whether she had been tricked by a fox or something, he looked around and realized that although it was dilapidated, it was definitely the house he had lived in before, and from the spacious back area to the rice storehouse at the edge, it was still as it had been built to his liking. Stunned and at a loss as to what to do, he thought carefully and realized that his wife had already died, and foxes and raccoons had taken up residence in the house, making it this dilapidated one. So perhaps a spirit had taken over and shown him her appearance from when she was alive. Or perhaps it was the spirit of his deceased wife, who loved him, who had returned from the other world to talk to him about their relationship. In any case, it was exactly as I had imagined it, and I was so saddened that I could not even shed a single tear. With his wife dead and the house in ruins, he walked around the house, muttering to himself, "I wish I could be myself again," to the tune of Narihira's poem. He found that the wooden floor of what had once been the bedroom had been removed, and a mound had been made of piled-up earth, with some kind of protection from the rain and dew. It was frightening, but also nostalgic, to think that perhaps the ghost of last night had come out from here. There was a container prepared to hold water for offerings, and inside it was a piece of wood carved into a very old piece of Nazuno paper pasted on it. The letters had faded in places and were difficult to read, but it was definitely his wife's handwriting. There was no posthumous name or date written, just a single waka poem recited with a pathetic expression of her final thoughts. Is this the only way I can survive until today, with this feeling in my heart? My husband did not come home in the autumn as promised, but I was fooled by the feeling that he would definitely come back, and I am so grateful that I have managed to survive until today. Now that Katsushiro had finally confirmed that his wife had died, he was overcome with sorrow all at once, and cried out loud and broke down in tears. Even so, it was a pity for him as a husband not to know what year, month, and day she had died. Thinking that someone might know, he wiped away his tears and went outside when the sun was already high in the sky. First, he went to a nearby house and met the owner, who turned out to be not an acquaintance of his. Instead, he asked, "Where are you from?" Katsushiro politely greeted him and replied, "I used to be the owner of the house next door, but I went to the capital to make a living there for 7 years, and when I returned last night, I found the house completely deserted and uninhabited. It appears that his wife has also died, and there is a grave, but there is no record of when she died, which makes me even more sad. If you know, please let me know." The owner of the house replied, "That's a sad story. I've only been living here for about a year, so I think she died long before then, and I don't know anything about her life. Everyone who lived here for a long time fled at the beginning of the war, and most of the people who live here now are people who moved here from other places after that. There is only one old man who seems to have been here for a long time. He sometimes goes to the house to pray for the souls of those who died. He must know the date of your wife's death." Katsushiro continued, "Then where is the old man's house?" The owner told him, "There is a field about 180 meters from here toward the beach where there is a lot of hemp planted. He is the owner of that field, and he built a small hut there and lives there." Katsushiro was delighted and went to the house, where he found an old man of about 70 with a severely bent back, sitting on a round seat in front of the garden hearth and drinking tea. As soon as he saw Katsushiro, the man called out, "Why are you back so late?" It turned out to be a man called Okina of Yuruma, a long-time resident of the village. Katsushiro first congratulated the man on his long life, and then told him in detail about his own visit to the capital and his unwilling long stay, to the strange events of the previous night. He was deeply grateful to the man for the kindness he had shown in building a grave for his late wife and holding a funeral for her, but he was unable to stop the tears from flowing. The old man began, "After you left on your journey far away, war began in the summer. Villagers fled all over the place, and the young men were drafted into service as soldiers. The mulberry fields around here quickly became overgrown with foxes and rabbits. Amidst all this, only that faithful lady believed in your promise to return in the fall and refused to leave her home. This old lady was also lame and had difficulty walking, so she hid herself inside the house, refusing to go outside. In the end, the house became the home of a terrifying monster known as the Kodama, and yet her courage in remaining there alone as a young woman was something I was deeply moved by, more than anything I had seen or heard up until that age. As autumn passed and spring came around, he came to the temple and passed away on August 10th of that year. I felt so sorry for him that I carried the soil and buried the coffin myself, and used the handwriting he had left at the time of his death as a grave marker to hold a memorial service for him. However, since I was originally unable to write, I was unable to record the date of his death, and since the temple was far away, there was no way for him to be given a posthumous name, so 5 years passed without change. Hearing this story, I believe that his spirit must have returned from the other world and expressed the resentment that had been building up for so long. Go to the grave once more and offer a proper prayer for him, I said, leaning on my cane and leading the way. Together, I lay down in front of the grave with Katsushiro and wept and mourned loudly, spending the night there chanting Buddhist prayers. Unable to sleep, the old man told the following story a long, long time ago, before my grandfather's grandfather had even been born. In this village there was a very beautiful girl named Tigona of Mana. Because her family was poor, she wore a linen kimono with a blue collar, her hair was not combed properly, and she had no shoes and was barefoot. But her face shone as beautiful as the full moon, and when she smiled it was as if a flower was blooming and shining. She was more beautiful than the noble women of the capital dressed in brocade and silk. Not only the villagers, but also the samurai guarding the capital and people from neighboring countries all approached her and adored her. But Tigona was the one who felt miserable and heartbroken. He was so saddened that he decided to die in order to respond to the feelings of many people, and threw himself into the waves of the inlet and died. This story was considered one of the most pitiful in the world, and people in the past wrote poems about it and passed it down to the next generation. When I was a child, I heard that it was very pitiful that my mother even made fun of it, but I wonder how much sadder Lord Miyagi must have been than the innocent heart of that child. He teared up as he spoke and could not contain his tears, because old people tend to cry easily and have difficulty holding them back. Katsushiro's sadness was so great and deep that it was difficult to put it into words. After hearing the old man's story, he poured his heartfelt feelings into a poem with the halting voice of a country boy. The men who loved Mama's Teganako in the past must have longed for her after she died, just as they long for their beloved wives now. It can be said that those who cannot express even a part of their feelings well can move the reader more than those who express them well. This was a story that was passed down and told by a merchant who frequently traveled to Shimousa Province.